I'm just gonna share my stuff there. Perfect. Am I good to go, Gio?
Yep, let's do it.
All right,
I'll
so
give you about a 15-minute warning or so, just so you have an idea of where time is.
sounds good.
Cool.
So yeah, so I'm Nicole O'Byrne. I am the varsity sports dietitian at UBC. I'm filling in for Emma McGredden while she's off on mat leave. I've been a dietitian for quite some time and I've worked in a lot of different areas. So I have a lot of experience working with athletes from various backgrounds. And I think, well, especially one thing that makes me a bit more unique is I also spent 5 years working in tertiary eating disorders. So it's a lot of work that I did there that I very much take into what I do with athletes in sport as well. So what I'm going to focus more on is the nutritional needs of female athletes and why females need to be looked at a bit different than males, and how we can't really take this one size approach that fits all. So Amanda went through some of this already with you guys, but just to kind of go through it in a bit more detail. Like Amanda was saying, and I agree, females are not small men. This was what Stacey Sims said, and Stacey Sims has done a lot of research in terms of female health and how it's different from males. But when we look especially at body composition, how they are a bit different is that when we look at our essential body fat, males have a lower percent of body fat than females do. So males are at about a 3%, whereas females are at about a 12%. And that's our essential body fat. So meaning our fat that we need to sustain life, essentially. And this difference comes in because females have childbearing, whereas males don't. So we need a higher percent of body fat in order to be able to do that. When we look at that on an athlete percentage, typically we see an athlete body fat in males to be about 5 to 10%, whereas females we see at about 8 to 15%. Again, there's going to be significant variation within this depending on the type of sport that you're in. So whether it's an endurance or a power-based sport, and even within that sport, there can be significant difference from athlete to athlete. We also have differences in our body water content. So males have a higher percent of body water. So they're about 60% of their body weight in water, whereas females are at about 50% of that body weight in water. Again, this is because of the fat percent difference. So females having a higher fat percentage were lighter compared to a male. We also do see differences in our bodies in muscle composition. So females actually tend to have a higher type 1 muscle fiber than males do. And then one of our biggest defining features, obviously, is our hormones and menstruation. So Amanda went through quite a bit on the hormones and the menstruation. I'll touch a bit more on that, but this is a really particular aspect that we do need to pay attention for our female athletes, because it does provide us a lot of information about their health and well-being. So obviously I'm a dietitian, so what this matters to me with sports nutrition. And why are we even concerned about this when we're looking at sports nutrition is that most of our sports research has actually been completed on male athletes. So we don't really know for sure if we can actually extrapolate all that information that we do know towards a female athlete, because we are fundamentally different from a physiological stance. So there is more and more being done, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, and looking specifically at female athletes, but we absolutely still need more information being brought out. And this is also why I advocate very much that it should not be a one-size-fits-all approach. We do really need to look at individual variances and differences between our athletes. So when we're looking at this from an energy perspective, energy balance is really important, and it's one of our primary things. So if we talk in very simplistic terms, we have our energy in, which would be all of our dietary intake, so whatever we eat and drink in a day. And if we were in balance, it would match our energy out. So this means all of our body's needs plus any training demands that we have. So if we look at this in what we then call energy availability, so that means how much energy we have available left over after we take away the energy we need for our sporting activities, and the remainder is how much our body can give to our basic fundamental needs. So meaning our resting metabolic rate, providing fuel for our vital organs, our just day-to-day living. So if we look at energy availability, What that means is in the day, we have a total energy expenditure. So this includes, like I have up there, our resting metabolic rate. And then in addition, we have what we call NEAT, so non-exercise activity thermogenesis. This is just sort of our day-to-day activities of life that we have, like brushing our teeth, cooking food in the day, walking around our apartment, talking. All these things require a significant amount of energy for our bodies to be doing in a day. And then on top of this, this is where we have our exercise energy. So between training, competition, and everything else that goes with it. And this is where we see a significant variation between athlete to athlete. So if we're looking at someone, how much energy they have available after they've done all this exercise energy in the day for these remaining blocks, if we say, for example, someone needed 3,000 calories to account for all of their exercise and energy in a day that they need, if that individual took in 3,500 calories, we would say they're in a positive energy balance. So they have a surplus of energy available to account for their resting metabolic rate and their NEAT. However, if someone is in a 2,000 calorie intake in a day, they're in a 1,000 calorie deficit. So meaning they do not have enough energy in the day to account for their resting metabolic rate and their non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Now, it's important to note that this happens for males and females. So I know there were some comments in the chat about not having differences in emphasizing some sort of typical stereotypes from males to females, and I absolutely agree with that because we see a lot of this throughout athletes in general. One thing that we do find though with females is that they do tend to report more low energy availability more often than male athletes. So it is something that we do need to be concerned about and look at for our female athletes. And why we care about this, like I said, is there's a really high prevalence of low energy availability in female athletes. So this is just some data from the last couple of years that we have here. And obviously this is not inclusive, there is a lot more, but just to highlight that this can be quite prevalent in all types of sports. So this one study in 2016, it was in synchro and elite swimmers, synchro, it was 100% prevalent of low energy availability. Elite swimmers, in that one study, they found 100% again. When looking at soccer in a Division I, in preseason, they found about 26%, whereas in season, it actually increased and went up to 33%. In female volleyball, they found about 20% low energy availability, and in track and field, it was at about 52. Now this last one in 2015, this was a mix between male and female, so a bit of mixed data there, but again, a very high prevalence. So this is obviously something from a nutritional stance that we very much need to pay attention to, and it's a very easy thing to help promote more energy availability. So when looking in females though, why this becomes a problem is what was originally called the female athlete triad. Now this was first talked about in the early 90s, and it was looking at this sort of triad between optimal energy availability, optimal bone health, and menstruation function. And they found that there's a spectrum between it of optimal health, where you had good energy availability, regular menstruation, and good bone health. And it went all the way down to suboptimal health, where we saw those that had low energy availability with or without an eating disorder or disordered eating. We saw menstrual dysfunction, and we saw suboptimal bone health, so osteoporosis. Now again, obviously this just excludes to females because men clearly don't menstruate. But like I said, we do see this very much in our male counterparts as well as females. So this led to the development from the International Olympic Committee of REDS, so relative energy deficiency in sport. So as you can see from the graph over here, the triad, the female athlete triad, fell in one corner of it, but it very much extends to many aspects of overall health and well-being. So if someone's having low energy availability, we can see a lot of negative health consequences within their overall body. So we see more risk of injury, we see a decreased training response. People aren't able to think as clearly, they won't concentrate as well, they're more irritable, We have decreased glycogen stores, decreased muscle strength, and also decreased endurance performance. So it really affects all aspects of that overall health and well-being and athletic performance. Where it comes though for female athletes is because they do menstruate, that is usually the first thing that starts to see change. So for female athletes, they have a very good indicator and a key indicator to tell whether they're experiencing any aspect of REDS or low energy availability. So Amanda went through this. I will just quickly go on this because she talked a bit about this, but like you said, a normal period's 21 to 35 days, and there's all different aspects to it from a hormonal stance that affects our menstruation. So the hypothalamus is our regulatory center that pulses out this gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that will stimulate the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland then releases our luteinizing hormone and a follicle stimulating hormone, which acts at our ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone, which then act on the menstrual cycle and create that regular cycle that Amanda went through. Now, if we have any differences in terms of any response from our hypothalamus or having less stimulants on the pituitary gland, that's where we tend to see differences in the menstrual cycle. So you can see there's a lot of different steps that need to happen and to have optimal functioning for us to have a regular menstruation. So our menstrual cycles take energy and they require energy to have normal cycles. Amanda went through these dysfunctions, so I won't go through them, but just to highlight again that there's 3 different types of amenorrhea that we see, or oligomenorrhea. So why we care about menstrual function in female athletes is because there is some studies that show it actually does have performance impacts. So this was a study done on female swimmers, and they were looking at adolescent swimmers. So they were younger, but what they did is that they compared regular menstrual cycle athletes compared to those that had menstrual dysfunction. And they monitored them over a period of 12 weeks and took various samples of hormones and time trials from that 12-week period. So what they did is they compared a 400-meter time trial from the baseline to 12 weeks. And what they found was that those athletes that had a cyclic or regular menstrual function actually improved their time over that 12 weeks. So they had an increase in 8.2% in terms of their time trial, whereas those that were ovarian suppressed or had an irregular menstrual cycle actually saw a decrease in 9.8%. So this clearly can play a role within our menstrual cycles, and if we aren't having regular menstrual cycles, it can significantly impact performance. So I'm going to go a bit through just some more specific nutritional needs, focusing in on female athlete. So carbohydrate, there's a lot of studies that actually show female athletes very much fail to meet their carbohydrate needs. And this is just very basic needs. So you can see from the graph here, a moderate training of just 60 minutes in a day requires at least 5 grams of carbs per kilo in a day. Now, what these studies have found, there was one study that showed that over 50%, so 51.5% of female soccer players consumed less than 5 grams per carb per day. There was a recent study that was done in Australia looking at female Australian rural football players, and they actually had only about 3 grams of carb per day. So female athletes are showing that they're significantly underfueling themselves in carbohydrate for their level of training. Most athletes that I work with train more than 60 minutes of a day, particularly when they're in season. And some can be upwards of 5-6 hours in a day. So if they're only having 3-4 grams of carb, they're significantly underfueling themselves, and you will see performance deficits in that. We also, if we look at fat, so females actually oxidize fat more during exercise than men. So meaning that females will have the ability to use fat more during exercise than men. Now this is thought because of, again, the estrogen. So it's primarily from, the estrogen, sorry, it's called 17-beta estrogenol. And that is what they think has the effect on the fat oxidization during exercise. So that hormone actually causes an increase in free fatty acids when a female athlete is exercising. However, we really don't know much more than that right now, and there needs to be a lot more research to kind of understand this better in terms of our female athlete and better understand what our female athletes' needs are in terms of fat intake in a day. What we do know, though, is that we do need to aim for intakes of fat to be above 20% of their energy intake to make sure that they're getting essential fat-soluble vitamins and those essential fatty acids in a day. So when we look at protein, one of the biggest concerns with protein, again, is that most of the protein studies have been done on males. So we don't actually really have good evidence to see what our protein needs are for our female athletes. What we do know, though, is unlike energy and carbohydrate intake, female athletes typically consume optimal quantities of protein. So there doesn't appear to be as much of a fear around having protein for our female athletes as there is around carbs and overall energy intake. So the recommendations are still similar to our males at that 1.6 to 2 grams. There used to be some thought that females needed much less than this, but there was a recent study that showed female athletes need at least 1.63 grams of protein in a day to maintain nitrogen balance. So that's simply just their daily demands of protein in a day. One thing that we do know with protein is that in recovery, females actually have a higher muscle protein breakdown rate compared to males. So that means that they actually spend more time in the day in a negative energy or in a negative protein state compared to males. So we do really need to be encouraging our females to consume protein and carbohydrate for recovery in that training time. The studies have shown females who have, they were looking at chocolate milk, so having some protein and carb in recovery showed that they did have a more time in a positive protein state over the day than being in that negative protein breakdown state. So again, we have some differences that we know between females and males. However, from the research, what we've seen is that they're very small differences from what we know right now. So it's not enough to warrant changes in our recommendations for females to males in terms of protein intake. I'm going to briefly touch on some micronutrients. There's lots that you could go into this and tons that we could look at. We need 52 different nutrients in a day to have optimal health. So you could obviously deep dive into this, but just as some couple highlights for this. Iron is one of our big concerns for female athletes. Obviously, females lose more iron than males because they have menstruation and lose it through the blood loss. However, athletes in general, so whether they're male or female, do have higher iron needs, and this is because of the activity. So they're increased at about 30 to 70% than the average individual. Now, female athletes in particular have a much higher prevalence of iron deficiency. So about 56 to 60% of female athletes present with iron deficiency without anemia, and 20% with iron deficiency anemia. So there is some need to pay attention to iron in our female athletes' health so that we're able to provide them with optimal performance and not experiencing so much fatigue and just tiredness, like that lethargy. Now, vitamin D is another concern, and this is for, again, both males and females. However, females are at further risk of having inadequate vitamin D because we do see more rates of inadequate energy intake from our female athletes compared to our male athletes. Why vitamin D is important for performance is that, particularly for athletes, vitamin D has been shown to have really important role in bone, but as well as immune health. And then we also do need it for muscle growth, repair, and cardiovascular health. Now, because athletes typically spend more time indoors training, they are at further increased risk of deficiency. Calcium is another really important one. A lot of us know calcium is very much needed for bone health. However, it's been found that about 72 to 90% of females fail to meet their adequate intake level of calcium. So again, if an athlete's not even fueling themselves enough for their overall energy intake, they're likely taking in much less calcium than what they need to help promote optimal bone health for their bodies. Finally, the last one I'll touch on is magnesium. Magnesium is critical for athletes. It supports their metabolic processes, energy production, oxygen uptake, as well as electrolyte balances. It also has roles in cardiovascular, neuromuscular, immune, and hormonal functions. So it's really important for just overall well-being. It is often inadequate in athletes, particularly, again, those who restrict their intake. So if you have an athlete who's not getting enough energy in, it's important to be looking at that magnesium and seeing if it is deficient. So just some tips and takeaways. Obviously, I could go into a way more about this. There's lots more that we can look at in terms of female health and their nutritional needs. But again, that we need to look at female athlete nutrition on an individual basis. And I would say this isn't just for female athletes, but for all athletes in general. There really is no one size fits all for nutrition, and it needs to be done on an individual basis. Secondly, female athletes absolutely need further education on the importance of energy availability and daily carbohydrate needs. There's lots of research that's showing that our female athletes are failing in these areas and they are not getting their basic needs. If someone's not getting enough nutrition to just fuel their bodies on a day-to-day, they absolutely will not be able to perform at a high level. We also need to monitor some of those micronutrients. So female athletes might be deficient for several nutrients that need to be corrected through diet for optimal performance. And finally, I always encourage my female athletes to be tracking their menstrual cycles and to better understand what their menstrual health is. It's a really key indicators for female athletes to tell how their body is doing for training and how they're responding to their training, and just their overall health and well-being. So we need to start that conversation more with our female athletes on the menstrual cycles and better understanding what theirs are. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Nicole. I've got a couple questions here in the chat box. The first one is, for female athletes not meeting carbohydrate needs for exercise, do the stats for athletes not meeting these include athletes on the ketogenic diets?
No, so these would absolutely not be looked at if someone's following a ketogenic diet, because they inherently will not be getting anywhere near their carbohydrate intake. So a ketogenic diet, you would typically be having at most 50 grams of carb in a day, but typically it's around 25 grams, which is the equivalent of a banana in a day. So by no means would they be included in this at all, nor would I even be recommending ketogenic for any athlete.
Do you recommend any vitamin supplements if there's a lack of nutrients?
So, I mean, if someone's having a good, well-balanced diet, so first of all, I don't necessarily recommend vitamin supplements because any vitamin is not third-party tested. So if you are taking a supplement, you need to make sure it's from a reputable source. And if you are a high-level athlete, you can run into the risk of having a positive drug test from a multivitamin or from a vitamin. So to me, the benefit of it when you can get it through food isn't necessarily that great. So I would first look at their diet to make sure they're getting enough. That being said, some athletes do like taking a multivitamin just for reassurance. In BC, we don't get enough sunlight year-round, so we do recommend and encourage athletes to take a vitamin D, especially for those that have indoor-based spaces, indoor training spaces, because they probably will be deficient, especially living in BC where we don't get as much sunlight.
Thanks, Nicole. And then next one, do you have any recommendations dietary-wise for athletes that struggle with PMS symptoms or just in various phases of their cycle?
So this is again where you can get into a lot more detail with it. So when we look at with like carbohydrates particularly, same with fats, we do see fluctuations in terms of how we utilize fats and carbs based dependent on someone's cycle. So there's different times in your cycle where we don't use carbs as well. So we tend to store more glycogen, and then other phases of the cycle where we use our carbs much more effectively. So this is where, again, I'd really encourage people to look at their menstruation on an individual basis, because you can better understand what your health is and really tailor some of those symptoms on an individual basis. There's not really, again, that one blanket fits all. It is very much individual, but they first really need to be paying attention to their menstruation. Also, too, if they're on any contraceptive, as Amanda said, it can mask those symptoms. So it's important to understand that before you're making recommendations.
Cool. What do you think about the social media impact on energy intake restriction, like from an influence standpoint? Like, do you think social media is a good thing or a bad thing when it comes down to this?
I mean, I don't have necessarily like research to back this up. However, my own personal view, and having worked in eating disorders for quite some time, I absolutely think social media can be a detriment, but it also can be a positive. I think our culture of like Fitspo and like just plates full of vegetables, or like those smoothie bowls that don't always have as much substance to it, are very harmful for some of our athletes. And that absolutely can be where some of our athletes are under fueling themselves and not seeing that full benefit of understanding. The amount of times I've had to explain to people that carbs are not going to make you fat by eating more carbohydrate, and really that it's going to help your body, not hinder it. That being said, there is a lot of really great Instagram accounts, particularly sports ones, that are starting to promote more body positivity and more inclusivity of sports and just overall health and well-being. One that I really like following is the University of North Carolina, their sports nutrition one. They do tons of body positivity and just really trying to break down some of those barriers for athletes of that you need to have this quote unquote like perfect clean diet to be a healthy athlete.
I, for one, am a huge fan of Fitspo, so that's good to know. For a coach who may be playing both roles, is there an ethical boundary one needs to be aware of when possibly dealing with an athlete who may be showing signs of disordered eating?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tricky question. And this is where, when you're talking to people, and Katrina might have more to say on this as well, but when you're approaching people, it's really best to be coming from a place of concern and not coming down as sort of like that top heavy approach. So when we've seen that people have more of a place of a concern of saying, like, not putting the emphasis on like weight, shape, food, body, but really just saying like, hey, you don't seem to be doing you don't seem to be like yourself right now. I'm concerned. How are you doing? How are you feeling? How are you doing overall? And taking that emphasis away from, again, weight, shape, body, food, whatever that might be, that you'll tend to build a better trust and alliance with your athlete, and that they'll be more open and honest with you. But if we take it and just focus on a performance aspect, that sometimes can hinder those thoughts and feelings. So if you're saying like, hey, you're not doing as well in the pool, or you're not doing as well on the track or on the ice or on the field, or whatever that formula may be, that sometimes can create more pressure on the athlete. And if they're having struggles already with their food or well-being, that can emphasize some of those things more, just thoughts of failure or shame or guilt of not maybe being at the level that they want to be at.
That makes sense. Evelyn asked just regarding veganism, other than the micronutrients you recommended and B vitamins, is there any other things that coaches or athletes should be aware of?
So one thing I always like to ask people if they're going to become vegan is why. And that's a really good place of understanding. Someone can absolutely be vegan out of just preference and choice, and that is 100% okay. However, I do like to ask them, because sometimes that can be a precursor to someone who's struggling maybe with their relationship with food. Veganism and vegetarian has become sort of this acceptable way for us to restrict certain food groups. And so if someone's really struggling with their body image or with their relationship with food, it can be a really easy escape to mask some of those fears. I know Joe knows I went through this year, but also game changers. So things like that, where are just promoting, again, this one size fits all sort of great, it's going to cure all your problems. So I really like to understand why they're doing it. You can absolutely get all of your nutrients that you need to from a vegan or vegetarian diet if you're doing it well and planned carefully. So if someone is doing it, I usually encourage them to speak with a dietitian to make sure that they are getting all of those necessary nutrients, particularly like iron and B12, because those do tend to come more from animal-based products, but you still can absolutely be getting some from plant-based proteins and plant foods as well.
Sweet. Claire kind of seconded Evelyn's question, but just wanted to know if there's anything they should watch out for, from a deficiency wise or performance risks or anything like that in their female athletes who follow a plant-based or vegan diet.
I would just say again of just overall, how is that athlete doing? Are you noticing any changes in them? Are you noticing any changes in their performance? If you are, those could be indicators that they might not be getting enough of the nutrients that they need to. So it's a good thing to approach those athletes again out of that place of care and concern of just say, hey, you don't seem like yourself. Are you doing okay? How's everything going? How are you doing with your nutrition, your fueling? But otherwise, I mean, like I said, if it's a well-planned and they're putting thought and time into their diet, you can absolutely get everything you need from a vegan or a plant-based diet.
Thanks, Nicole. Great questions, everyone. I'm going to ask, if no one else has any questions, I'm going to ask Poonam and Amanda and Katrina to unmute. And I'm going to just ask a quick question, and then hopefully we can keep on with the chat as we go forward here. As a 6'5", 300+ pound male, all of this is hugely useful for us as coaches, but is there a way specifically that we should be approaching any of these topics so we don't come off as assholes? Like, I'm not going to just bluntly say, hey, what's going on here? But as females, like, what can we do better to approach our female athletes and maybe even our female coworkers for that matter, to make sure that we're coming off in a way that it's out of care, even though like the way I would talk to a football player may be way more to the point and abrupt, knowing that I probably have to deal with this a little bit differently with someone of the similar athletic ability who's a female and the same age. Bueller?
I think Katrina has a good answer. Do I?
Oh, way to throw her under the bus.
Honestly, my initial thought was, again, like getting to know your athlete, because I think sometimes we tend to assume that females or males will respond in a certain way because they fit in that category, and it's not necessarily the case for a lot of athletes. Like, even working on building social relationships and connection with male athletes, like I find that they don't often get as much time to do it, for just as an example, but I think they benefit just as much from it. So I don't know, I'm kind of going off track there, but I think being careful not to make assumptions necessarily before you are knowing your individual athlete. But if anyone has any other thoughts.
So well, how about this? So I'll phrase it this way. If I'm seeing some things that align with everything you've talked about, whether it's reds or, maybe someone's behavior is changing at a certain time and it's affecting things, is it better for me to address that person individually and just say, hey, I just want to get some more information? Or is it better for me to do this in a group setting? I bring this up because I remember when I first started out, I was working with a high school program that had 24 boys and 4 girls. And I'd always ask, does anyone have questions? And all the guys would ask the stupid meathead, can I do curls? Can I do this? And the girls in the class, it was a high school PE class, would never say anything. So one time I told the guys to get lost 5 minutes early. and all of a sudden it was like I had 1,000 questions in 2 minutes. And a lot of it had to do just with being around their peer groups. And I'm just looking on here, like Jack, Boyle, Derek, Shauna, all of our coaches, Cole. We work with sometimes teams where the males and females train together. So like swimming, for example, golf, they train together a lot. So like just wondering if is it better to start as a group approach or an individual approach if we want to have these conversations? Because something like having our female athletes track their menses, like coming from me versus coming from Amanda, it might be a little more impactful coming with someone who might know what that's like.
I can jump in there. Actually, Katrina and I were just exchanging messages while Nicole was finishing up, just talking about our own personal experiences as athletes and just saying like, man, if we knew this information when we were competing, what a game changer, you know? And I think it's definitely a topic that's being more discussed and it should be, because it has such a major impact on your performance. I think that, you know, to your question, Joe, I think it definitely needs to be education. If we can provide that information to the athletes as a group or individually, whether it's in your individual meetings or, you know, it's brought up as a slide in a presentation, but just having that education and that information to go out to the athletes first, and then allowing them to absorb that information, and then kind of creating that environment so that they know it's okay to come to you for those questions, I think kind of creates a little bit of both. You know, then you have approached them as a group, but you're also opening the door for the individual conversations. Because as an athlete, when you don't know something about, you know, how to increase your performance, all we really know is like, we got to get in the gym, we got to train on the field or in the pool or wherever you are, and that's going to help us. But there's so many other factors that play in that we need to be equally as ready for and prepared for.
Yeah, I can go after that one. I definitely agree. It starts with education because we don't know what we don't know. And I think getting the message out there can come from anyone, regardless of like your age and your sex and your background. I think where some of those intricacies come in is the dynamic of the relationship. So if I'm a female athlete who wants nothing more than to be like a top performer and playing, I'm going to be hesitant to go to my head coach, whether they're female or male, and tell them that I'm struggling in one way or another, or that I'm dealing with some issues. And then I go to, like, if I'm talking more specifically around like menstrual cycle and body image, I think there's a piece where you want to talk to someone who can empathize and can sympathize with you. So if I'm like telling a male about the terrible back pain and cramps that I'm getting during my menstrual cycle, like, sure, they can listen, but they don't, like, ultimately they don't understand. Like, they don't know what that feels like or what it is to go through that. So yeah, I think that, like, I think I basically just agree with both Poonam and Katrina in that education can come from anyone, but there needs to be someone in the circle. And it doesn't have to be the coach, it doesn't have to be the mental performance, like, it doesn't have to be the nutritionist, it doesn't have to be the S&C. It just needs to be someone in the circle that the athlete feels comfortable enough talking to these and about these issues with.
One thing that I do kind of want to jump in on is, I think if you're worried about underweight or overweight with an athlete, that shouldn't be a group conversation, is that needs to be definitely one-on-one, and you need to be quite careful about how you approach that conversation, because like publicly, you know, posting weights of athletes and stuff, I've seen it done, and it, like, that is definitely a no-go in my opinion. And yeah, so I think around that, you definitely need to be careful. And if you don't feel like you necessarily have the skills around nutrition, or if you're worried about someone's psychological health, then making that appropriate referral is also a good option as well. Like, you don't have to try and be that role for everyone, because it's not always appropriate as well.
I would just also agree sort of just with what Katrina's saying on there, and just some of the experience I've had of working with some of the teams. Some I've worked with a bit more closely over this past year, and we've had some really great instances, or I've had some great instances where I was doing some talks with some of those mixed teams. So we were separating them out with just doing with the male athletes and some with the female athletes. And then for some of them that we actually had much smaller groups of some of those athletes. So being able to see them a couple times in a larger setting and then a smaller setting, and then again, even one-on-one with those athletes has been really helpful of just delivering that message again and again and again. I'd also agree with what Katrina's saying with like just saying concerns of like weight shape, of not making those public. I think we all also need to start recognizing that everyone comes in a different weight, shape, size, and that's absolutely okay. And as athletes, we definitely have these types of builds that are particularly prone to have more athletic success. However, there's lots of variation within that. Even thinking of tennis with Serena Williams, she was very much not what you thought as the typical tennis player, female tennis player, yet has had a ton of athletic success. So I think we need to start making more of just an individual approach overall in all aspects of sport, and not recognizing that we have these cookie cutters of that you're however tall, what weight, this build, you're therefore going to be successful in this sport.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm going to ask one more question since there's nothing in the chat. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. What about in like a weight control sport? So like your boxing, jiu-jitsu, wrestling type of sports where like you kind of need to track weights as an example, and the scheduled weigh-in doesn't give a shit when your menses is, right? And I know that could be really challenging for some women as someone who's coached it. So if there is any kind of thoughts around that, because I do know we've had a national team or national level wrestler who did miss weight in the last Olympic cycle, and it came out later that it was this, and I know who her coach was, and I'm pretty sure there was not a lot of empathy involved in the process. So just curious if there's anything you guys would add to that.
I can jump in first. So from a nutritionalist perspective, when working with people with weight classes, we typically would want to try and fluctuate those over a season. And we typically want to take it looking at like a macro and then micro cycles within that. We want to try and drop that weight as we get closer to that competition and the prime times, and allow them fluctuations in their weight in a season. A lot of times those athletes are putting themselves at weights that aren't sustainable for themselves, whether that's that they're trying to work up to a weight class or work below a weight class. So we do want to have those variations, but what we want to try and do is get them within 1 to 2 kilos of their weight class a week or two before their competition, so that really alleviates that stress of having to make weight and weigh in, so that you aren't having to do such harmful, damaging processes or things to the body to try and make that weight if you're in an extreme situation. So that's where I'd say, just as a plug for some of the IST, and that as coaches, you really need to rely on your IST and on your SNC and the dietitians and sports psych, in that there's those professions out there to help support you in your coaching. And if you can allow those in and let more of those disciplines help, it can really take some of the pressure off of you as a coach and allow you to coach.
That makes sense.
And sorry, I just wanted to add to that. And I think it's extremely important that we continue to push the research in these areas, because again, what Amanda said, what you don't know, you don't know. And if coaches aren't being aware or even trying to understand some of these areas, there's no way that the organization is going to make any sort of changes to allow that, that female athlete to be weighing herself outside of her menstrual cycle, because they just don't understand how it impacts them. And so if we're not having the conversations and the research isn't out there to support some of the things that we're saying, there's not going to be any changes on sort of that grand level. So I would just say that, this is, again, more push for sports science, but more push for female specific information to come out.
So Thanks all. And if no one has anything to add, I'm going to just read off one thing from Sam here. Just if you have any feedback or thoughts on this, please send your note to sport.science@ubc.ca. It's in the chat there. Our goal is to try to keep this up while we're dealing with the COVID crisis right now. So please stay tuned. We'll probably do something again in a month. But if you have any thoughts or feedback, please feel free to share it to that email address. If no one else has any questions, I'm just going to ask Nicole, you can probably stop recording, and maybe if the speakers and Sam can stay on for a second.